back in this series, the story that I'll tell. I wonder whether you have a favourite story. I know kind of it's not for everyone. Maybe you've got a favourite story from childhood that you kind of think, oh, I love the Velveteen Rabbit or something like that. I don't know. This week we had Adam came, I was going to say came home, but he doesn't live at home. So Adam came back from Canada for 5 days. Joe was with us as well. And when Adam came in the house, one of the very first things he did was to go through the bookcase and look at what we had and have a discussion with Joe as to what was a good book or not. Discussion turned into, you know, they've got their ideas. Now, it was a good thing. And for them, kind of books are a massive thing. They're always got their head in a book. And it's not for everyone. But I wonder whether you have a favourite book or maybe a favourite author that you kind of keep going back to time and again. Do you know, in thinking about this, I thought, wouldn't it be great to be a writer? Anybody else ever had that yearning to think, oh, I'd love to be a writer? I mean, it's a part-time job for one thing, I know that. The thing is, whether we realize it or not, we are all writing our own story. We're writing a story. We're writing our own story. And the thing is, we can take charge and write that story, or we can allow someone else to write it for us. What I want to encourage us to do during this series really is to take charge and to make sure that our stories actually are worth telling. So will your story, when it's written at the end of time, will it be a story of playing it safe, keeping within the lines, just getting through life? Or will your story be one of adventure and daring? Or great romance? I mean, you might not be inclined to kind of do physically dangerous things, go to physically dangerous places. But maybe if you're a Christ follower, maybe you could start by just beginning to pray a dangerous prayer or two and see where that leads. Anyway, today we're examining the idea that the voice you believe will shape the story you write. The thing is that although we kind of feel we have control over our life, we all have this narrative that goes on in our heads and forms a soundtrack to our lives. And our story, therefore, can depend a whole lot on what we're listening to. Did you know that the average person has around, how many thoughts every single day? How many thoughts do you think you have every single day? Yeah, Martin has about 10, that's about right. 5 of them are the same thing. Food. We have about 60,000 thoughts every single day. One commentator reckoned that 80% of those thoughts are negative. You can see that if that's anywhere near true, then that's going to have a huge influence on how our story goes. What if we changed that up? What if we made it so we had less negative thoughts going through our heads and more positive thoughts? How would that change our life? Because what's in our head influences our life. In fact, one person said, people don't believe what you tell them. They rarely believe what you show them. They sometimes believe what their friends tell them, but they always believe what they tell themselves. If that's true, then we ought to be telling ourselves positive things, not negative things. Those things that shape the story we write. We all have thoughts running through our heads. We've got to get the right thoughts in there. We've got to hear the right things. I noticed this week, came up on my Facebook page, that Peter Kay has just announced a new tour. I think the first one for about 6 years. He's been in a bit of isolation. Any Peter Kay fans? The comedian Peter Kay? Anybody heard of Peter Kay? Peter Kay is probably my most favourite comedian, and he, on his last tour, he did this kind of 10-minute slot, maybe a bit more, on misheard lyrics from pop songs. We can't show it because of YouTube don't like us doing those kind of things, so you can go and watch it. I watched it again this week for about the 14th time and still laughing. And he starts it off by saying he was doing karaoke one time. Take that, wash your back, wash your back. What's that? Want you back? Want you? I've been singing Wash Your Back for the last 10 years. And it kind of goes on and does this whole spiel about misheard lyrics. I wonder when it comes to God, I wonder have any of us misheard the lyric that God is singing into our life? When we want to write a better story, are we mishearing what God's saying? In the book of Judges, in chapter 6 in the Old Testament, we read this. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. We're going to see that when the Israelites cry out for help in the book of Judges, God raises up someone to help the nation, to help them to write a better story. But there's something we need to understand. If we look at the context of this before we get stuck in, the thing is, right now, Israel's got 3 enemies. They have the Amalekites. They're always in Israel's face. If you kind of read Israel's story, they're going to crop up time and time again. They never give up. It kind of reminds us of that thing that constantly irritates us all the time. You know, that thing that keeps coming back at you, you just can't get rid of it, it irritates you. In the New Testament, Paul was said to have this thorn in the flesh. We're not quite sure what that was, but it was just something that constantly irritated him. He couldn't get rid of it. It might be that kind of that pain, or that husband. Same thing, I guess. Something that irritates us, or that person that you kind of run into and you can't get away from, that irritates us time and time again. The Amalekites are like this to Israel. Then you have the Canaanites. The Canaanites come riding in on iron chariots, and they have the monopoly on iron. Israel can't get a hold of any iron. Canaan was the producer of iron. They had, if you like, the technological edge when it came to battle. Do you kind of ever feel that you're behind the times technologically? You're kind of losing out because the screen doesn't work properly. You know your phone does all kinds of things, but all you can make it do is ring an alarm at 8 o'clock in the morning. These things are like amazing, aren't they? Aren't they? They even tell you the cricket score, Ken. I don't know the score, I'm just prompting you. Oh, good. Well done. Do you kind of ever feel you're missing out because the world is going faster and faster and you can't keep up with it? Well, the Canaanites have got that edge on Israel. And then the third enemy of Israel is the Midianites. These are the biggest threat to the Israelites. They ride in on camels. In fact, this is the first time that the camel's been used in warfare. They've got this speed edge. All of a sudden, Israel's faced with this triple threat of the annoying Amalekites, the Canaanites who've got what they haven't and can use it, and the Midianites bringing this unprecedented, never seen before threat. The Israelites live, quite literally, in lockdown. Now, we don't know what it's like to live in lockdown. Can you remember that? I mean, it seems like it's like a little while ago now, but it's 2020, 21, 22. Anybody still living in lockdown? You know what it's like living in lockdown. And the same for the Israelites. They're in this position where it feels like a season of fear, loss, and hopelessness. Now, I don't know all of your stories, but even maybe me saying some of those things prompts you to think. Maybe it's prompting you to think now, if only you knew. If only you knew where I am. I'm living just like the Israelites. Maybe you're living in a little bit of fear. Maybe of someone or something. Maybe you're living in fear of bad news. Maybe you just feel you can't keep up with things. Maybe you're living with loss, which is so difficult. Maybe you just feel at the moment a little bit hopeless and that there's no way you can turn things around. And it feels like that for Israel right at the start of our story. And into Israel's story at this time, God sends an angel to call one man to help them to begin to write a better story. Judges 6:11. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Imagine that. Imagine this afternoon, you sat at home, or you're on the sofa, you're dozing off, Columbo's on the telly. It's the law. Columbo on a Sunday. If you're not watching that, you're probably not Christians, to be fair. You're dozing off in front of the telly, and the angel of the Lord appears and says, "Go for it, mighty warrior." I wonder what you'd hear. Our friend Leon Evans suggests that Gideon didn't hear mighty warrior, but he heard whiny warrior. Not mighty warrior, whiny warrior. The Lord is with you, whiny warrior. Gideon didn't see himself as this mighty warrior, and so these words just don't resonate with him at all. He's listening to what's already in his head, and he hears whiny warrior. Maybe God's been speaking to some of us, but we don't truly hear what he's saying, because actually we can't quite believe it. I mean, even if it's not God, you've probably had those moments when you've been stopped short and you think, did she really say that? Nah, it can't be right, because it kind of doesn't align with what's in our head, because you can't quite believe what you're hearing. Sometimes I think God speaks to us and we're just the same. Did he really say that? The thing is, the voice you believe will shape the story you write. The voice that Gideon is hearing in his own head starts to affect what comes out of his mouth. Verse 13. "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of Midian." Can you see that Gideon is interpreting the words not from what is actually being said, but from what's in his own head, what's in his own belief system. And yet God is operating outside of what we believe about ourselves. Gideon's like, that can't be right. because my own experience doesn't align with this. Gideon has this deep questioning attitude. Why did you allow this to happen, God? How can you say I'm a mighty warrior when you didn't step up? Where are you in the middle of all this? Are we going to end up like Gideon? Are we going to finally give up on what God is actually saying to us? My bet is that for most of us, at some time or other, or maybe some times or other in our walk with God, we've been like that. Where are you, God? Why did you allow this to happen? And it's okay to ask those questions. Of course it is of God. But Gideon's not just questioning. It's allowing him to skew his belief in who God is. In verse 15 he says again, "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." I'm the weakest and the least. That's Gideon's narrative. That's the story of his own life. I'm nothing. I'm nothing to look at. I've got nothing to offer. I am literally the least. I kind of know what that feels like to some extent. I can be the least. And it starts out small, and I tell myself that, I'm kind of really nothing. Don't amount to much. Can get by, but not much more than that. And then, as one author wrote, those small things that we tell ourselves, they weave themselves together, and they kind of add on and add on and add on until they become a straitjacket. And we can't write a better story because of the way we've constricted ourselves. I don't want any of us to be like that at all. So, in the time we've got left, I kind of just want us to remind ourselves, or maybe discover for the first time, a number of ways from this story that we can write a better story. 3 things. First thing, God's expectation is not determined by our limitation. God's expectation is not determined by our limitation. When your story collides with his story, it always leads to a greater story. When we kind of collide with what God's doing, it always leads to a greater story. I was thinking about this Greebfinch wise this week. I was kind of backtracking over our time at Greebfinch, and I kind of started almost right at the beginning. And right at the beginning, Jan and I had a little, we would call it a battle, probably let's call it a discussion with the leaders of the church about running Alpha. And the leaders in their wisdom, actually I think the leaders in their wisdom, the words they said were, "We're not sure about Alpha, but we trust you, so do it." And we kind of felt it was a God thing. There was quite a number of people came on the first Alpha course. I think we baptized about 8 people in the sea following that. Really don't want to go in the sea ever again after that lot of baptisms when the sea was so rough. But it was an illustration of our story colliding with God's story and what can happen. People becoming Christ followers. Or much more recently, bringing it up to date. Janet, I haven't got permission to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. That's fine. It's nothing bad. Janet had a meeting with Ozzy. Do you know Ozzy the Fishman? Ozzy the Fishman. He sounds a bit like... It's a bit like a superhero. Ozzy the Fishman. The man from the fish and chip shop. Ozzy, a really nice guy who's now been in touch with me. And we'll talk about this more after we've talked about it with the elders, but don't tell the elders until tomorrow, okay? Keep it to yourselves. The elders don't need to know until tomorrow. But he's wanting to set up a kind of a place where people can come and have soup and a roll wants to get involved with us to do it. And it kind of feels like our story colliding with God's story. God brings people alongside, kind of out of nowhere, really. We need to talk about it and pray about it, but it kind of feels like that's an opportunity for us to write a greater story as a church. What about you spiritually? God's expectation is not determined by our limitation. I'll be honest, if God's expectation was determined by my limitation, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now. Consistently throughout my time leading up to taking on this role and through my time here as senior leader, I'm always feeling not good enough, not trained enough, not prepared enough. And it's very easy to let those thoughts become limitations on who we are, limitations on myself. But by the grace of God and by the grace of you too, I've been able to some extent, fulfill this role for 15 years. And it's because God doesn't go, oh yeah, you're right, you are not very good. Actually, God moves in and gives us the strength and what we need. You see, when it comes to being good enough or not, then I suspect some of us need to change our language in our heads, especially when we factor God into the equation. God's expectation is not limited, is not determined by our limitations. In fact, if you want to do something this afternoon, look at any of the great men and women of the Bible, and you see their limitations time and time again. Yet God consistently lifts them above that. Number one, that's number one. Number two, God doesn't adjust his expectations to meet our limitations. God could have said, Gideon, you're right. You are the least. But listen, Gideon, if you could just maybe stay where you are, read your Bible, pray a couple of times a week will be good, and don't be naughty, that'll be good. Well done, mate. If you could just do that, be fine. Don't think about trying to change the world. That's obviously going to be too much. God could say, I'll adjust my expectations to meet your limitations, and we're good with that. But God doesn't do that. He calls us into something far greater. Our weakness doesn't disqualify us. In fact, our weakness qualifies us to be used by God. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, said, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. When I'm weak, then I am strong. That's kind of really different to the way that we often see the world. But imagine, when I am weak, that's when God moves in to make me strong. One pastor said, our very limitations often unlock our usefulness for God's glory. God uses our trials, disappointments, and even our sufferings to make us productive in his kingdom. So while the world sees broken, distressed, and hurting people as inconsequential, God makes his people weak in order to strengthen them by his power. That's a thought to think over. Mull that. If you're feeling weak, God takes the weak to show his power. My weakness, if you like, becomes a portal for God's power. If I was strong, I wouldn't have the access to God's power. But by my weakness, God gives it to me. So if you're struggling, if you're feeling weak, then remember, your weakness allows God to work through you. Then, thirdly, Final thing, let his expectation become your inspiration. God wants to say to all of us, let God's expectation right now become your inspiration. What is God calling you to? I'm really firm believer that if you are a Christ follower, if you're living the life that Christ has called you to, and he's calling you to something right now, something that will get written into your story. Wouldn't it be great if we could write our story based on what God is calling us to and how in our weaknesses we responded? I bet if I pushed each person in this room who claims to be a Christ follower, you could tell of that moment in your past when you felt really ill-prepared for something. When you went through something you really would have liked to have gotten out of, but you came through it well. You exceeded expectations because God was in the mix, pulling the strings, quietly behind the scenes, strengthening. Well, I think right now, God is calling us to a greater influence on our world. God is calling us to new depths of commitment and loyalty to him. And not everyone will be up for that. And not everyone will respond to that. And not everyone will be able to write that into their story. But those who are ready for new depths, those who are ready to be committed, to give themselves to God, their stories are going to be incredible. You see, at the end of the day, we can write the story of how we've not been good enough, of how our limitations have held us back, of how we've been a victim. We can write the story of how our life has been brought down by bad things that have happened to us. We can write the story about how we never quite had enough money or resources to really do what we wanted. We can write the story of how life just knocked it out of us. Or we can change the voice we believe so that we believe the things that God thinks about us, so that we believe the things that God speaks over our life, so that his expectation becomes our inspiration. Which one will you choose? Let me pray.